Forget everything you think you know about medieval romance. Forget the knights in shining armor and the fairy tale castles. We're not going there. We're going to a place where the church tried to dictate what happened between the sheets, where a wedding night could become a public spectacle, and where your very soul could be damned for being in the wrong position. This isn't a love story. It's a story of survival, superstition, and sexual practices so bizarre they'll make you grateful to be alive today. This was a world governed by fear, where intimacy was a public matter, and desire was a dangerous, often sinful, impulse. We're about to step back into a time when public whippings punished secret affairs and wild medical theories governed love and lust. What you're about to hear is the dark, repressive, and sometimes horrifying truth about sex in the medieval era. In the medieval world, there was no corner of life the church didn't touch, and that power extended deep into the most private space imaginable, the marital bed. For a medieval couple, intimacy wasn't just a matter of personal passion. It was a heavily regulated duty, a spiritual obstacle course designed by theologians who, in theory, had no first-hand experience with the subject. The central doctrine was that sex was for one purpose and one purpose only: procreation. The idea of sex for pleasure wasn't just frowned upon. It was considered a sin, a concession to the weakness of the flesh. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential thinkers of the age, taught that lust was a corrupting force that undermined reason. This philosophy trickled down into a dizzying list of rules that dictated not just why you could have sex, but how and when. Imagine being a newly married couple. The desire for closeness is overwhelming. But first, you have to consult a calendar dictated by the divine. Was it Sunday, the Lord's Day? Sex was forbidden. A holy day? Forbidden. Was it during a major liturgical season like Lent or Advent? Absolutely forbidden. When you added up all the feast days, saints' days, and days a woman was considered unclean, the opportunities for sanctioned intimacy shrank considerably. While some scholars claim this left only a few days a month, the reality is more complex, and many couples simply ignored or bent the rules. But the regulation didn't stop there. Even on a permitted day, a couple was expected to adhere to a strict physical script. Only one position was widely deemed acceptable: the so-called missionary position. It was believed to be the least passionate and therefore the least sinful arrangement, one that reinforced the proper order of things: man active, woman passive. Any deviation, the woman on top, for instance, was condemned as an unnatural act. Oral or anal sex, or any act that couldn't lead to conception, was often considered a grave sin. To enforce these ideals, the church created penitentials, handbooks for priests to use during confession. These were detailed catalogs of sexual sins and their corresponding penances. A man who engaged in a forbidden position might be sentenced to fasting on bread and water. The church was a silent, ever-present third partner in many medieval marriages, turning the act of love into a source of constant anxiety. In an age with little concept of a right to privacy, what happened in the bedroom rarely stayed private. When the church's spiritual threats failed, secular authorities often stepped in with brutal and public punishments. Adultery and fornication weren't just personal failings. They were crimes against the social order, and they were punished in the open for all to see. Imagine a young servant woman who falls for a stable hand, and a child is conceived. Her pregnancy is a public scandal. She could be dragged to the marketplace, her head shaved to mark her shame, and publicly whipped. Adultery was considered the most serious of these transgressions, especially for a woman, because it threatened the legitimacy of the male bloodline. The double standard was staggering. While some legal traditions were harsh, the idea that a husband could kill his wife and her lover with total legal immunity is an oversimplification. Punishments varied greatly by region and circumstance. A man could frequent brothels with little more than a slap on the wrist, but a wife's infidelity was a crime against property, her husband's property, and was punished as such. In some parts of southern France, a particularly bizarre punishment for adultery called la course, or the run, was recorded. The guilty couple was forced to run naked or in their undergarments through the town, where they might be beaten by crowds. One version of this horrifying spectacle, which may be more folkloric than fact, even had the woman holding a leash attached to her lover's genitals as they ran. It was the ultimate ritual of public humiliation. Even the validity of a marriage could become a public matter, leading to one of the most invasive legal procedures, the impotence trial. If a wife claimed her husband couldn't consummate the marriage, she could take him to court to have it annulled. The husband would be subjected to a humiliating physical examination by a panel of court-appointed matrons or doctors. In France, this practice was sometimes taken to a surreal extreme with the trial by Congress, where the husband had to attempt intercourse with his wife in front of an audience of experts. This was a rare procedure, but it highlights the immense pressure to perform. Failure meant not just an annulment, but the utter destruction of his reputation. Whether through public whipping or a courtroom examination, the message was clear. In the Middle Ages, your body was not entirely your own. If the church's rules were baffling, the medical theories were even more bizarre. Medieval medicine was a strange cocktail of ancient Greek philosophy, folklore, and religious dogma. Anatomical knowledge was shockingly poor, which led to some truly wild ideas about sexuality and health. One of the most persistent beliefs, dating back to ancient Greece, was the theory of the wandering womb. Physicians believed a woman's uterus was a free-floating animal inside her body, driven by a desire to procreate. If a woman, particularly a virgin or widow, went too long without sex, her womb would become angry and wander through her body, causing suffocation, seizures, and a condition known as hysteria. While this idea was more rooted in folk medicine and less influential among learned physicians by the later Middle Ages, its legacy was powerful. The treatments were just as strange. Doctors would apply sweet-smelling perfumes to a woman's vagina to entice the womb down, while placing foul-smelling things near her nose to drive it away from her upper body. This was part of a larger, paradoxical belief system. Based on the ancient theory of humors, it was thought that both men and women needed to regularly expel bodily fluids to stay healthy. This led to a contested medical theory, the fear of death by celibacy. Some medical texts warned that prolonged sexual abstinence could cause a buildup of toxic fluids, leading to illness or even madness. This put people in an impossible bind. The church demanded chastity, but some doctors warned that not having enough sex could kill you. This created a strange tension where even masturbation, a practice heavily condemned by the church, was sometimes recommended by physicians as a medical treatment to release these dangerous fluids. Then there was the medieval understanding of conception. It was widely believed that for a pregnancy to occur, both the man and woman had to experience orgasm. This had a dark side. In some legal cases involving rape, if a woman became pregnant, it could be used as an argument that she must have consented or even enjoyed the act, since conception was thought impossible without her orgasm. A woman's own body could become evidence against her, turning a moment of violation into a legal judgment of her supposed pleasure. What you've just heard is only the beginning of the bizarre reality of medieval life. If you're finding this glimpse into the past as shocking as we are, and you want to keep exploring the darkest corners of history, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells us you want more deep dives like this. Now, back to the unsettling world of medieval marriage. Modern culture is filled with images of medieval romance, the brave knight pledging his love to a fair lady. This concept, courtly love, was indeed a product of the Middle Ages, but it was a beautiful fantasy that stood in stark contrast to the often brutal and transactional nature of actual marriage. Courtly love emerged in the 12th century songs and poems of troubadours. It painted love as a noble, all-consuming passion where a knight devoted himself to a lady, often a married woman of higher status. This love was rarely consummated. It was about longing, suffering, and secret devotion. In fact, a core tenet was that true love couldn't exist within marriage. Marriage was about duty, love was about desire. This fantasy was popular among the nobility because it offered an escape from the reality of their own marital arrangements. For the aristocracy, marriage had almost nothing to do with love. It was a strategic transaction arranged to forge alliances, secure land, and produce heirs, often when the bride and groom were still children. A noblewoman was often a pawn in a political game who might not meet her husband until their wedding day. While the myth of the chastity belt is a later invention, the desire to control a wife's sexuality was very real. Some wealthy couples even endured public bedding ceremonies, where witnesses would follow the newlyweds to their chamber to legally verify that the marriage was about to be consummated. Since the purpose of marriage was to produce a legitimate heir, the pressure to perform was immense. As we've seen, a man's failure could lead to a public impotence trial. This wasn't just personal embarrassment, it was a political disaster. Impotence was sometimes even blamed on witchcraft, with people believing a rival could cast a spell to magically bind a man. Meanwhile, the lower classes had a bit more freedom. With less land to worry about, they were more likely to marry for love or compatibility. Premarital sex, while officially a sin, was often tolerated, especially if a couple was already betrothed. The gap between the fantasy of courtly love and the reality of medieval marriage was a chasm. One was a world of poetic devotion, the other a world of contracts, public pressure, and the cold duty of procreation. For most people, marriage wasn't the start of a love story, but the start of a lifelong contract. In the contradictory world of medieval sexuality, perhaps nothing was more fraught with paradox than the view of women. On one hand, some theologians and doctors believed women were biologically more sexual than men. On the other, any woman who acted on that desire outside the strict confines of marriage was condemned with a ferocity rarely applied to men. This fundamental double standard was woven into the fabric of society. A husband's visit to a prostitute was often viewed as a minor sin, a necessary evil tolerated by society. The argument was that prostitution provided an outlet for uncontrollable male lust, thereby protecting respectable women. Men who frequented brothels faced little social stigma. For a woman, however, any sexual activity outside of marriage was a potential catastrophe. An unmarried woman who lost her virginity brought shame on her family. An adulterous wife was seen as committing a crime against her husband's honor and property. This control over female sexuality was visible in everyday life. An unmarried girl might signal her availability for marriage by wearing her hair long and loose. But once married, her hair had to be covered, a sign that her sexuality now belonged exclusively to her husband. Even the language around sex reflected this power imbalance. Men were described as the active participants who took or knew a woman. Women were passive. Aphrodisiacs and love potions also reveal this dynamic. Men might use them to make a woman fall in love, while women were more likely to use them to rekindle a husband's passion or ensure fertility, goals that reinforced her marital duties. In this world, a woman's desire was seen as both a biological reality and a moral crime. She was viewed as a vessel of temptation, a daughter of Eve whose lust was blamed for the fall of mankind. While men were often given a pass for their natural urges, women were trapped by a sexuality they were believed to possess, but were forbidden to explore or control. Beyond the regulated world of marital sex, there was a realm of practices so condemned they were often called unnameable or unnatural sins. These were the ultimate taboos, seen as crimes against God and nature. The punishments reflected a society gripped by fear of anything that deviated from the procreative norm. At the top of this hierarchy was sodomy, a broad term for any non-procreative act, but its primary target was same-sex relations. In the early Middle Ages, attitudes varied, but by the High Middle Ages, theological condemnation had translated into brutal secular law. While enforcement varied greatly, in some parts of Europe, being convicted of sodomy was a capital offense. The methods of execution were horrific, designed to purify the world of the sin. In 13th century France, some laws prescribed castration for a first offense, dismemberment for a second, and being burned at the stake for a third. Lesbianism was also condemned, though it appears less frequently in legal records, likely because it didn't involve the spilling of seed. Still, it was seen as a threat to the male-centered social order. The other great, unnatural, sin was contraception. In a worldview where the sole purpose of sex was procreation, any attempt to prevent it could be seen as defying God's will. Some influential theologians even equated contraception with homicide. This belief didn't stop people from trying. Desperate to control their fertility in an era of life-threatening childbirth, women might use risky potions or rely on folk remedies and amulets, like wearing weasel testicles in a pouch. These practices highlight the desperation of women trapped between the terror of constant pregnancy and the damnation promised by the church for trying to prevent it. These ultimate taboos reveal the core anxieties of the medieval world. It was a society obsessed with order, divine, social, and bodily. The brutal punishments for these sins against nature weren't just about morality. They were about defending a fragile worldview against the perceived threat of chaos. From the cold, contractual nature of marriage to the surreal spectacle of public impotence trials, from a calendar of forbidden days to a medical belief in a wandering, angry womb. The sexual landscape of the medieval era was a labyrinth of fear, superstition, and control. It was a world where intimacy was policed by the priest and the physician, where public shame was a tool of the state, and where the most natural human desires were branded as sins. We've journeyed back to a time when your soul could be damned for the position you took in bed, and a woman's orgasm could be used against her in a rape trial. The romanticized image of knights and ladies pales in the face of this harsh reality, a reality governed by a constant, oppressive tension between religious doctrine, flawed science, and the unyielding realities of human desire. Doesn't modern life, with all its complexities, suddenly feel like a paradise of privacy and freedom? The ability to love who you want, how you want, without fear of public whipping or damnation, is a luxury that was utterly unimaginable in the world we've just explored. If this journey into the dark and bizarre side of history captivated you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next exploration into the past's most shocking stories. Hit the like button to let us know you want more content like this, and head down to the comments to tell us which of these medieval practices you found the most horrifying. We want to hear from you. Until next time, stay curious.